Good morning, everyone. It's Sunday, October 27th. Senator Ed Markey is our guest this morning. Let's go on the record. Decades of experience on Capitol Hill, but facing a political landscape with deep divisions in the final days of the election cycle like no other. The senator's in the chair. He's here to talk about stakes. It's time to go on the record.
From WCVB Channel 5, the inside word from Washington to Beacon Hill. Today's newsmakers are going on the record.
Welcome to OTR, everyone. I'm Ed Harding.
I'm Charmin Sacchetti, and with us this morning is United States Senator Ed Markey. Thank you, Senator, for being here.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
And what is it now? I'm trying to do the fast math in my head. Just a little more than a week now. Americans are going to, people have already voted, but we're going to the polls, and the race for president is still a toss-up at this moment. I mean, you could barely put a piece of paper between the two. Fascism is now being spoken about openly. Vice President Kamala Harris saying that former President Donald Trump is a fascist. The gloves are off. Trump has called Harris a communist and worse. So generally, Senator, what does that say about this moment in American politics?
Obviously, democracy is on the ballot in November 5th. It's on the ballot. General Kelly, his former chief of staff, he said that Trump is a fascist. General Milley, his former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he has echoed the same sentiments. Trump is talking about using the military. Trump is absolutely a fascist. He's also a misogynist, a racist. He's a homophobe. He is trying to actually elicit the worst instincts of the American people. And that's why this is such a sharp contrast, because Kamala Harris is trying to reach out and have people look ahead and believe that we can have a better country that includes everyone. So to a very large extent, we're about to have a referendum on whether or not this nation can be a multiracial democracy. Because Trump is trying to divide this country along racial lines, along gender lines, in a way that's unprecedented, and he's doing it in a way that is clearly fascistic, and it must be fought, and we're going to have a chance on Election Day to once and for all answer this question.
I almost can't believe I'm asking the question in 2024, but are you concerned about post-election violence?
I am concerned. I was in the Capitol complex, obviously, on January 5th, 2021, when Donald Trump incited a riot, incited thousands of people to come down to the Capitol as we were attempting to count the Electoral College votes. And those people came up the sides of the buildings. They came through.
You were there on January 6th.
I was in the Capitol complex that day.
And you had to be escorted out?
And it was absolutely one of the most frightening days in the history of our country, where Donald Trump actually was encouraging people to question whether or not he had been defeated in an election. When Mike Pence refused to follow his orders, his supporters inside the Capitol were saying, hang Mike Pence. Right. So we're very fortunate that no senator or House member was killed, but police officers were. Many died subsequently from the injuries which they suffered. So my fear is that we could, in 2024, see a repetition of what happened in 2020 and in January of 2021, because Donald Trump is actually already saying that this election will be stolen if he loses. And I believe that without question, there is a real threat that is going to be posed to democracy. And the question is going to be, can our country respond to it? I think that what General Milley and General Kelly have been saying is a warning, and we're going to have to put the police, the military, in a situation where, if necessary, they will have to be deployed in order to make sure that this time we do count the Electoral College votes if Donald Trump loses again.
All right, we have so much to get to. I want to ask you about Democrats and holding the majority in the Senate. They hold it right now by a single member. As things stand right now, Republicans are likely, it appears, to flip control of the election. No matter who wins the White House, what would that mean for Massachusetts?
We're not accepting the certitude that we're losing the Senate. It's all on the ballot.
If it does happen, what does that mean for our state?
We're going to win, okay? We're going to win the presidency. We're going to win the Senate, and we're going to win the House as well. We're going to have a very powerful Massachusetts congressional delegation. Yes, it's going to be close, but there's only one seat that is really in contention that the Republicans can win, and we're throwing all of our resources into it out in Montana. And I have great confidence that Jon Tester will be able to survive the challenge to him. And if that's the case with Kamala Harris as president, we'll just go back to where we were in 2021, where Kamala Harris, now it'll be Tim Walz, will just have to come on and break the tie, because it'll be 50-50 in the Senate once again. But this time, again, we're going to have the House in Democratic control.
All right. Well, let me talk about it's the Senate that votes on Supreme Court justices. You have called for expanding the court, among other reforms. What do you think will happen here in the coming years?
Well, obviously, Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell stole 2 Supreme Court seats. And with those 2 stolen Supreme Court seats, with the addition of the one seat that was more legitimate, those 3 appointees actually repealed Roe versus Wade.
Do you have the support for something like that, though, yet?
Well, they repealed Roe versus Wade, and Clarence Thomas said in his concurring decision that that they should also look at same-sex marriage. They should also look at the right to contraception. So my belief is that we have to expand the Supreme Court. We'll have to repeal the filibuster. Would have to then have a vote on the expansion of the Supreme Court.
To what number?
Well, we would need to take it to 13 in order to recreate the same balance that we had at 9 if the court had the justices that had been selected legitimately first by Donald Trump, when Mitch McConnell said that there's a principle that you don't confirm Supreme Court justices during an election year. So we went from February of 2016 all the way to January of 2017 with only 8 Supreme Court justices. Then all of a sudden, when Justice Ginsburg passed away, they had a new precedent where a week before the election, they confirmed Amy Coney Barrett. Okay, so there's absolutely no principle here, but they stole the 2 seats, and it's kind of like lunch money down the schoolyard. If you let them keep doing it over and over again, then they're just going to take advantage of you. So we now have to do something that would counter that effort, and that would be to expand the court. We'll have to repeal the filibuster, but otherwise we could go an entire generation with a 6-3 Supreme Court overturning environmental laws, women health care laws, labor protections, educational laws that have been on the books for generations. And I don't think it should be a choice that we avoid. We have to do it.
Next item. I'm going to say a name to you. First thing that pops in your head, Ralph DeLatorre. Ralph
DeLatorre engaged in a criminal looting of the Steward Hospital system of the state of Massachusetts. He took over the system as a CEO who promised he was going to save it. Instead, with private equity, he took the whole system private. He allowed for a real estate trust to come in to buy the hospitals and the land underneath it. The Steward system then had to pay rent to these to the real estate investment trust, and as a result, the whole system went bankrupt. Norwood Hospital shut down, Quincy Hospital shut down, Neshoba Valley shut down, Kearney shut down. The other hospitals have needed to be rescued now by Governor Healy in order to keep them open.
Congress has voted to hold him in contempt, and he ignored the subpoena and refused. You were at the heart of all of this, by the way, at the core of it. What happens next? We haven't seen him hauled off to confinement or something. So what happens next?
Well, I had a hearing back in April up in the State House and invited Dr. DeLatorre to appear. He refused to do so. I left his chair empty. Shaman was there actually reporting on that hearing that day. Then in September, we had a hearing down in Washington. We left his chair vacant. He refused to comply with the subpoena which we had issued, which was, by the way, the first subpoena from the Health Committee since 1981. And so as a result, working with Bernie Sanders and working with actually a Republican senator from Louisiana, Bill Cassidy, we held him on the Senate floor
what's
in
next?
criminal
What's
contempt, and
next?
it was the first time in 50 years that
Okay,
the
but
Senate
that's good.
held an individual in criminal
what
contempt.
happens to him now?
Now the Justice Department has the case. He is in criminal contempt of the Senate, and now the Justice Department has to now take action against him. But he is not going to escape accountability. He is not going to escape for the responsibility that he has back not only to the hospitals here in Massachusetts, but there's 30 of these hospitals across the country who were looted
In
by
red
Ralph
and
DeLatorre.
blue states, worth
in red and
mentioning.
blue states, which is why Senator Cassidy is my partner on these issues in the contempt citation, in the subpoena, because he's from Louisiana, and he did the same thing in Louisiana, in Arkansas, and other states that he did to the Massachusetts system. And we need legislation that will pass, my Health Over Wealth Act, that will have transparency, that will be built into the system so that we can see what is happening when these real estate deals go down, that the Department of Health and Human Services nationally will have to sign off on any of these financial transactions, and that there's transparency that the patients, that the workers get, so that they
need
get
that.
protections as well, the notice, so that these hospitals are not just shut down with no protections whatsoever, which is what happened in Massachusetts.
We're on the record with Senator Markey. Stay with us.